Welcome to Witch Hunt Victim Stories, where we discuss the lives and trials of individual witch trial victims. I'm Josh Hutchinson, and today I'm presenting Margaret Scott, an enigmatic woman who was convicted of witchcraft during the Salem Witch Trials and executed. Margaret was hanged September 22nd, 1692, with Samuel Wardwell, Martha Corey, Mary Esty, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Anne Prudieter, and Wilmot Red. No information is available about Margaret's birth or parents. Her maiden name was Stevenson, and she married Benjamin Scott in 1651. Margaret resided in Raleigh. Margaret Scott was first accused of witchcraft in early July 1692, but was not arrested until late in the month and did not face her first hearing until August 5th. Unfortunately, no record of this examination has survived. Margaret faced the grand jury on September 15th and was indicted for afflicting Mary Daniel and Francis Wycombe. The evidence against Margaret came in the form of testimony from Sarah Coleman, Philip Nelson, Sarah Nelson, Thomas Nelson, Mary Warren, Elizabeth Hubbard, Ann Putnam Jr., John Burbank, Daniel Wycombe, and Francis Wycombe. Sarah Coleman said, about the 15th of August last past, that she was tormented 3 or 4 times by Margaret Scott of Raleigh or her appearance by pricking, pinching, and choking of me, and I do verily believe that she is a witch. Sarah and Philip Nelson testified that for 2 or 3 years before Robert Chiletto died, we have often heard him complaining of Margaret Scott for hurting of him, and often said that she was a witch, and so he continued complaining of Margaret Scott, saying he should never be well so long as Margaret Scott lived, and so he complained of Margaret Scott at times until he died. Thomas Nelson claimed that 6 years ago the last winter, Margaret Scott of Raleigh widow desired me to bring her some wood, and spake to me several times for wood, and I told her that I owed her 10 shillings, and I would bring her wood for it, and she was not willing to set of that. Earnest she was for me to bring her wood. Denied her. Soon after this, one of my cattle was dead in the stanchial, and stood up on his hind feet, and kneeled on his knees afore. And little after this another of my cattle was dead in the yard, his neck under a plank at the barn side, as if he were choked. And after this, and ever since, had hard thoughts of this woman, and my neighbors told me, something more than ordinary that my cattle died so, and I do verily believe that she is a witch. Mary Warren, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Ann Putnam Jr. alleged that they saw Margaret Scott afflict Mary Daniel of Raleigh before the grand inquest. Mary Warren said Scott hurt her, said Warren, also before the grand inquest. Elizabeth Hubbard said that Margaret Scott afflicted her before the grand inquest. And Ann Putnam and Mary Warren affirmed to the grand inquest that they also saw Margaret Scott afflict Francis Wycombe in presence of the grand inquest. Daniel Wycombe testified that about 5 or 6 years ago, Margaret Scott of Raleigh came to my house and asked me if she might glean corn in my field. I told her she might if she would stay whilst my corn was out of the field. Said Scott said, "You will not get your corn out tonight." It may be I told her I would. Said Scott said, "Maybe not." At that time, my wife gave said Scott some corn, and then Scott went away, and presently after said Scott was gone, I went with my cart and oxen into the field for corn. And when I had loaded my cart, I went to go home with my corn, but the oxen would not draw the cart anyways about from home, though I were not 20 rod from my door, and I could not get any corn out of my field that day. The next day I took the same oxen and put them to the cart, and the said cart and the same load of corn they did draw away with ease. Captain Daniel Wycombe owned the above written evidence to be the truth before grand inquest upon his oath. John Burbank and Francis Wycombe attested to substance of this above written evidence. As that said Scott said, "It may be you will not get your corn in tonight, therefore let me glean tonight," and that the oxen would not go forward, but backward with the load of corn, nor the corn could none of it be got in that night. Francis Wycombe saith that quickly after the first court at Salem about witchcraft, Margaret Scott, whom I very well know, or her appearance, came to me and did most grievously torment me by choking and almost pressing me to death. And so she did continue afflicting me by times till the 5th August, 1692, being the day of her examination. Also during the time of her examination, Margaret Scott did most grievously afflict me, and also several times since, and I believe in my heart that Margaret Scott is a witch, and that she has often afflicted me by acts of witchcraft. Upon hearing the evidence, the grand jury chose to indict Margaret Scott, and her case went to trial, where a different set of jurors heard the same evidence and pronounced Margaret guilty of the capital crime of witchcraft. Margaret was hanged on September 22nd, 1692, along with Martha Corey, Mary Esty, Alice Parker, Mary Parker, Anne Prudiater, Wilmot Red, and Samuel Wardwell. Margaret's name was not included in the 1703 or 1711 Act to reverse attainder. She was not exonerated until 2001, when she was cleared along with Susanna Martin, Bridget Bishop, Alice Parker, and Wilmot Red. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Witch Hunt Victim Stories. Be sure to check in every week for a new story and listen to our main episodes every Wednesday. Thank you. Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.